All right, welcome to the Yukon Project live event. Today we're going to talk about buying cars, what you can do to save thousands of dollars making your next purchase of an automobile, and the tricks of the trade, and what you can learn and what we can do to be better purchasers and better consumers. Let's just jump right. As always, a little bit of a disclaimer that we are not. This is not professional advice or financial advice. If you need specific financial advice for your circumstance, you should consult a professional. All right, Steve, you've got the first question for us.
Yeah, so this is such a tricky, conversation. So I'm just going to kind of lay this out. So clearly the car industry is something that has a major impact in a person's home finances, personal finances, and their long-term financial success. In America, according to the latest statistics, there's over $1.56 trillion of auto loan debt, and about 3 million personal cars are purchased annually, which that's got to have a major impact. And so the first question is, Nathan, how should you go about getting a car loan to save you real meaningful dollars so that your household can stay ahead of the game and you can have a reliable mode of transportation?
Well, good question, Steve. Let's start with the most important thing about a car loan, which is going to be the interest rate. And there's really two things that go into what interest rate you're going to get. First is going to be your credit quality. How good a credit do you have? And the second is going to be how you shop around for that loan to make sure you get the lowest rate that's actually available to you, regardless of your credit. And so for that reason, I always recommend for people to go to their current bank or credit union very first and see if you can get pre-qualified for a loan.
But how do you do that if you how do you do that if you don't know what car you're buying? Because isn't the credit union or the bank going to look at you and say, well, I don't know if you're buying a Rolls Royce or a Kia, so how am I supposed to pre-approve you for a loan?
Well, right. And it could even be they're going to ask you, is this for a new car or a used car? So it goes even deeper than that, instead of just assuming that it's even going to be a new car. You might need a $3,000 loan, or you might need a $75,000 loan. But there's a couple of different ways that the bank will go about it. And it really depends upon the bank or the credit union, or even the online financier that you use. What you're going to first want to know is at least approximately how much the car is that you're looking for. That's usually the good question of what kind of car you're going to be looking for. They may ask you exactly how much you're needing to borrow, or they may just do a blanket pre-approval and say, here's what you're qualified for, buy a car underneath this and you're okay.
That's interesting. Is that harder to do if you've got a lower credit rating, if your credit score is a little bit lower? How much leeway does a bank give you?
So if you're using, I'm not going to say bank, because banks are more tough. Credit unions, especially if you've had a long-term business with them, are typically going to give you a little more leeway if you have a lower credit score, if you've got a solid history with them. But still, there's going to be some variation there. One of the things they're going to look at is what's called the affordability process. So they're going to take an estimate based on how much you can afford to repay every month. And they're going to use that information to really trigger what can you afford and how much can they give you. But a lower credit may also mean that you have to have a greater down payment on the car. So some banks will offer all the way up to 125% of the car value as an auto loan. Now, you ask me if that's kind of a high rate. Well, that's because people are sometimes underwater on their cars or other things, and so they'll offer that up. But if you've got a low credit score, you might only be able to get 75% or even 60% of the car value on your loan, as well as just having a lower overall amount. So there's extra things that are going to factor into that.
So let's circle back a little bit. Why is it a bad idea, if it's a bad idea, to take a loan with the company that you're buying the car from? You're at the car dealership. It's so easy. They've already got all your paperwork. They've got the information. Why not just make a purchase? Use them.
So we hadn't got that part yet. So I won't say you shouldn't use them. And in fact, there are many times where they're going to give you the best rate possible, but they're not required to give you the best rate possible. And that's why you want to start with your bank or credit union, especially if they have a pre-qualification process that does a soft credit check. That way it doesn't even impact your credit score, but you know roughly where your credit I shouldn't say that right, where your interest rate's going to be for that credit. So if you go into your bank or your credit union and they say, hey, I'm going to offer you a 5% interest rate at, for a $30,000 car, well, now you already have that prepared. So when you go in to do the negotiation with your car loans, if they come back and say 6%, you can say, no, thank you. I've got a better rate already. And we'll dive in a little bit deeper to that. When car loans, when we're car lenders, or I should say, when car resellers go in and run your credit, they don't check one bank. They check a bunch of banks. But this is a profit-making process for them. So they want to get you in the loan that's going to make them the most money. So they may have loan offers from 3 or 4 different banks, and they don't have to offer you the cheapest one. They could offer you one that's significantly more expensive than the others. And
can I add something? You also have told me in the past they might get the cheapest one and then mark it up.
That's the other process too. It's what's called a reserve in lending. And so I believe this may be a little bit different in most states, but it's not always exactly. But in general, what they have is called a reserve on the interest rate. So say Bank A offers you an interest rate of 5%. Well, the car dealer can actually add up to 2% more on your interest rate as part of the reserve. And if they get you to sign that all the way up to 7%, they get an extra bonus on top of it. So they make more money. So Steve, if you're qualified for $40,000 at 5%, that doesn't mean they're going to offer you 5%. They could even go to the cheapest bank and say, Steve, Bank A is going to offer you 7%. And if you don't know that that's not a good deal for you, you might take it because you don't know what they actually approved you for. That's why you want to go to your bank or credit union first, so that you know you have the absolute best rate possible and you have a baseline comparison that you got independently. Now, is there more questions to that, or do we think we covered all that already?
Yeah, so I just want to simplify this because I'm just the average Joe. So 3 million people are buying cars annually. 3 million people should be walking into a bank first with an idea of the loan, just so they can understand. When they ask for the loan, it should not be a hard pull on their credit. It should be a soft pull.
Most places nowadays, now not all banks and credit unions will do the soft credit check first. Most will though. And I think that's just something you need to ask for. Is this going to be a hard inquiry or a soft inquiry for a pre-qualification? If they say hard inquiry, back off, go do some online shopping. There's about a half a dozen banks and credit unions that will offer loans wide open to anyone in the marketplace, not just to you. And so you can find a bunch of those online, and 2 or 3 of them will actually do a couple of different things for you. One, they'll give you a pre-qualification. A couple of them will even help you shop for the best rate and might even be able to help you get a discount on the car itself.
Okay, so just again, simple-minded guy here. Go to your bank first. Ask them.
Absolutely.
Second, go to the dealership. Don't tell them how you're going to pay. Ask them for the same rates.
Now, let's step into that. I think that's the next lead in to how to get a good deal on the car first. Because you don't want to tell them you've got another piece of financing, but I typically would tell people that you should let them know you're interested in financing, but you're still going to want to shop the car first. And that's a little bit of a trick. Know that you're open to that because they might have promotional financing. For example, I did this when I bought my last car. I went to my bank. I had a 5% interest rate in my back pocket. I was pretty happy with that. I went over to the dealership. Well, they had a promotional rate going. I was able to get 2% because it was a promotional rate, which was much better than that. Now, I wouldn't have known what was good or bad if I hadn't done that, but that 2% rate was fantastic. Actually made me put less down than I wanted to on it, or what I was originally planning to.
Well, what's important to point out is that there's a reason why a dealer may be able to give you a better deal, right? They're already making money on the actual sale. But the other reason is that dealers are really incentivized to get the sale, especially of a new car with you, because it means that you're more likely to use them for maintenance and they can make money on you over a long term. So it's not unusual that they might try their best to give you the best deal for them for the financing, because they're doing everything they can to get the full life cycle of the profits off that sale of that automobile with you.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing. It's a good argument. They definitely want to do that. They're going to always at every step try to make as much money as possible from you. And so that's just really a trick. And that's why I say go to the bank first. Most of the time I believe that the lender, the dealer is actually going to be able to get you a better rate than the bank that you probably found, because they're going to shop from a much larger stream and you're going to have a competitive environment when they're in there. But you want an independent piece of information just to hold it to the side and make sure that you're getting the best rate.
Okay, so what do you do if you don't like the rate that the dealer gave you? Like you believe you could get a better rate. What do you do?
If it's me, first thing I'm going to do is walk away. Now, if you haven't already at that point in time, if you haven't already gone to a bank or credit union, then go on after that. If they didn't offer you a good rate, go to the bank second. That's still okay. It's not as good as going first, but that's okay. And if you didn't get a good rate from your bank and you didn't get a good rate from the dealer, well, then maybe it's time to start going back and looking at your credit and saying, is there an issue with my credit that's preventing me from getting the right kind of loan?
Talk a little bit about that credit, because I think that credit is a really important thing. How important is credit to getting a good deal versus, I mean, can I get a good deal on financing by just putting more down? Or how much does your credit report and your credit score impact the kind of financing you can actually get?
So putting more down is typically just going to change, I should say, it's not really going to change the interest rate you're going to get. It might change your approval, and it might change a little bit on the loan amount you get. So if you're putting $20,000 down on a $60,000 car, you might be able to get approved when you couldn't if it was only $10,000 down. So there's different things that are going to play into that. But the actual rate itself that you're going to get is highly correlated to your credit score. Getting approved is correlated to other things, but the actual rate is really going to be very tied to your credit score and how likely it is that you're going to pay that loan.
And which score is that?
Most often, auto lenders actually don't use your standard FICO scores. What they're going to use is called the FICO Auto Score. And that score ranges, instead of the 300 to 850 that most credit scores range, it runs from 250 all the way up to 900. What this does is it allows them to see a little more detail in your ability to repay a car loan. And that's kind of interesting. But here's the other side of it. If you look at your standard credit score, it's going to be close enough to tell you what's going on. So while seeing the exact credits, you're not going to see the exact credit score that the lender is going to use or that the dealership's going to use. Don't worry about it. It's not that different, other than it has a little bit more on the touch on the high end. If you've got a 750 or 760 credit score for your standard FICO score, you're probably going to be just fine and get the best rates.
You know, I've got a graph here from the Wall Street Journal that was published recently. I'll show that. When we're talking about making payments over time, that's a lot of money, right? Every single payment, especially at the early stages of your loan, a big chunk of that payment is going to principal in the first year.
Absolutely, it is. A lot of it's, or she said, I think you meant to say, in that first year, a lot of that payment's going to be going to interest.
Yeah.
And that's true. And so there's some major things. I did a quick check on some math the other day. Just as I looked at that same graph you were talking about, I did a little bit of math on it. I didn't go all the way up to deep subprime and the highest rates, which are in the 12 to 15% interest ranges. I stayed a little bit down and said, okay, well, let's just take a look at fair credit. What is kind of that prime, near prime range. And it looked to me like right now, typical interest rate's about 9%. Versus if you have great credit, you're going to get somewhere around the 3 to 5% range. The 3% are actually going to be in the specialty financing versus the overall financing that you would get from most banks, which is going to be near the 5%. But let's just do a quick math on that. Great credit at 5% versus fair credit at 9%. And let's take the average cost of a car right now, which is about $35,000. Well, if you go out and you finance on a 5-year loan, which is pretty common, you're starting to see more and more 72 and 84-month car loans. I would say stay away from those. So that's why I went back to the 60-month loan. I think they're more responsible. A 60-month loan at 9% interest rate, that's going to be $727 a month. And that $35,000 car would cost you $43,593. Now, that's over $8,000 in interest you're going to pay at that 9% rate. Now, you're still going to pay some interest if you have a good credit, though. You're going to have to pay that 5% if you don't have cash on hand. Let's take a look at that. At a 5% interest rate, that same loan for that same $35,000 car is $660 a month. It's a $67 a month savings. Over the life of the loan, it's over $4,000 in savings.
Okay, so how long does it take to go from fair credit to great credit?
That's a good question. I can't tell you exactly how long because it's all going to depend on exactly what's in your credit score, what's in your credit report. I can tell you that at a bare minimum, it's going to take 30 to 45 days. And that's because of how credit reports process and how the data moves. So you're going to expect that it's going to be at least 30 to 45 days. Now, that's if you have money on hand and you can go out and fix the major issues that are on your credit report. If you can't, and it's going to take a little time, for a 60 to 80 point jump, which is what I would say fair credit to great credit change is, it might take you more like 90 days to 180 days, maybe even a little bit longer to take that far jump up.
But still, you're talking about a couple months to 6 months to say $4,000, which is a lot of money.
Yeah, if you can make the changes needed in your credit report, then absolutely. I think you could wait 2 months. Oftentimes people with fair credit, they only have a couple of things really wrong. Usually it's their utilization on their credit score, on their credit cards. It's one of the biggest things. You pay down those balances if possible, and you can see a great big spike in your credit score, and you're going to be able to see a lot of improvement.
So here's a tough question. And this may be a bad question. So I'm just going to throw it out there, and you can tell me whether this is traveling into dangerous territory. Let's say I have $5,000 saved up to put down on my next car. At what point does it make more sense to use that $5,000 to pay down credit card debt in order to boost my credit score and increase my loan on the car? Is there a simple rule of thumb to think about that? Or is that kind of, a mixed bag in terms of the way we approach that?
Oh, there are about a dozen factors that would go into answering that question outside of that 5,000. But let me hit on a couple of those because I think it's a good question. It's an interesting question. And it's really going to depend first on what's the bare minimum down payment you can use for that car. So if you've got $5,000 sitting around for a down payment, you're going to have to use some of that. And so that's what you're going to have to look at. Some of that's going to be needed to pay taxes and things of that nature. Almost certainly, you're not going to be able to finance 100% of the car. So you're going to want to know that information if you can. And again, a pre-qualification might help you do that. The second thing is really going to be around what's the interest rate and the total outstanding balance that you have on your credit cards. So let's give you an example, a real simple example of who it would be a great idea for. Let's say Steve, and I'm going to pick on Steve again here for a minute. Steve needs $1,000 as a down payment for his car, no matter what. That's a bare minimum. So he can actually use $4,000 either for the pay down on his car or pay down his credit cards. Now, if Steve's sitting out there and he's only got 2 credit cards and his total utilization rate is 80%, but he's only got $4,000 in debt because he has a couple of small-ish credit card balances, him putting that $4,000 to the credit cards and paying them off is going to be the much better way to use that money. First, he's going to bring his utilization down to 0. That 80-point change in his utilization, it's going to add somewhere between 70 and 100 points to his credit score almost immediately. That's a fantastic thing. That's the 30-day I'm talking about. So he's brought his utilization down. But if he's been carrying that $4,000 balance on his credit card, he's also paying 22 to 24, maybe 28% interest on that. So now he's going to stop paying interest and save himself some money over there. And then he's going to come over here and he's going to save a lot of money on his car as well. So having all that money and just putting it towards a down payment, if it's not required to get the car, it's not, I wouldn't do that. I would absolutely take that money and put it over. Now, on the other side, if Steve's sitting over here and he's got $50,000 in credit card debt and he's got a $250,000 credit limit, that $4,000 isn't going to make a lot of a change. And it might be best to go ahead and put it on the car loan. I don't know for sure because there's a couple of other things factored in. But if you have a smaller balance on your credit card, I would absolutely go ahead and pay that off first. It's going to save you money both on the credit cards and on the car loan.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about the credit card is that the reality is because the credit card is unsecured debt, it's almost always going to have a higher interest rate than a new car note. And so to your point, you can save a lot of money making sure that that unsecured debt is paid down as much as you can, especially if you take that, what you would have paid to the credit card, and you put it against your car note when you get it.
Absolutely. And almost anytime you get a car note, they're going to have no prepayment penalty. So if you're saving $100 a month in interest from by paying off your credit cards, take that $100, roll it back into your car loan. So instead of it being a $650 a month note and you paying $650, just pay $750. Bring that interest down fast. Putting that money in there early, especially during that first year of your car loan, it's drastically going to reduce the total interest you paid. It's much better to pay it early than it is to wait.
Awesome. Well, today's been very helpful.
All right. Any other questions we had out there today?
Yeah, before we go, let me ask one more question. I think it's really interesting, this idea when you are negotiating with a car dealership, especially when they're trying to upsell you on all sorts of features on your car. One of the most popular questions they're going to ask you is, what payment are you looking for? Right? They are essentially, that question seems innocuous. It sounds like they're being really generous and making sure that you can afford the car that they are going to sell you. How do you deal with that question? Because it feels like a trap.
Well, it feels like a trap because it is a trap. Anytime I'm talking to people and asking them, hey, how do you get the best deal on a car? The first thing I'm going to tell you is never answer the question of what kind of payment are you looking for? It just gives away too much information to the dealer. And what they're going to do then is they're going to work very hard to get you to the payment, because here's what happens. You say, I can afford $650 per month. And so they're going to do all the work and get you to a $650 payment and forget about all the other economics. And then they're going to say, hey, you said you could do $650, so here's your loan. And then you stop to look at it and they've charged you an extra $2,000 on your car, and they've given you a 7-point interest rate when it should have been a 5% interest rate. And so when somebody asks me that, I just tell them, look, we're going to look at the car first, and we're going to find the value of the car. Then we'll work on finances. The payment is just a piece of math on the back end. I always say, jump in first and get the best deal you can on the car. Then move forward and get the best deal you can on the loan.
Yeah, you don't want to give them so many.
Make sure you can afford the payment.
You don't want to give them so many different levers, because when you give them a monthly payment that you want to afford, they can push that loan to a 72-month loan. They can do all sorts of things to make it look like they're making something affordable, when all they're doing is saddling you with more debt or more car than you really need.
Yeah. And I'll give you a personal example. About 6 years ago, the second or third time I bought a car, so I was still really new at this process, maybe more than that. I shouldn't say 6 years, probably 10 years ago. I absolutely had a dealer do that to me. And I caught him before we signed the paperwork, but he tried to do it. We were talking, I answered his question. He said, how much do you want to pay? I think I said something like $500. It's all I could afford. Well, we were looking at it, and I looked at it and knew that he could do better on the interest rate. And he was only about $30 off at that point in time in the negotiation. And he walked off and he came back, and all of a sudden the payment was less. And I said, well, what did you change? And because I looked at it and it said nothing changed. The interest rate didn't change. The amount for the car didn't change. I was like, oh, well, we added 6 months to your term. I'm like, well, that's just a really bad deal. All you did was take that $25 a month and put it towards the end and ended up making me pay an extra $1,000 in interest. So he didn't actually give up anything. He made it a worse deal for me just to meet that number. And so that's why I will say never give them a payment amount. Focus in on what's important, which is the loan amount and the interest rate.
All right. This has been a great discussion. We could go on forever. There's all sorts of other stuff we could talk about, but we're going to cut it off here. If anybody out there has additional questions about this or any other personal finance topics, post them in the link below, post them below in the comments, and we will almost certainly get to it in a future live event. Thanks for joining us.